Our next speaker is Michael Rooney. Michael's the National Carbon Manager for Greening Australia. Michael has over 10 years' experience in the design and implementation of large-scale environmental programs.
Just to tell you a bit about Greening Australia, so we're a non-government, not-for-profit, been around for 30 years, experience in restoration science and implementation of environmental projects, sort of increasing focus on science and large-scale landscape-scale change, as well as integration of environmental sort of restoration projects into productivity and sort of integration with land use and land use change. Just a bit of a warning from Stuart. Obviously there's lots of acronyms in this. Government loves acronyms. The carbon market loves acronyms, and these are just a couple. I've tried to avoid them where possible, but sometimes with the length of names it's a bit hard. CFI, Common Carbon Farming Initiative, Australian Carbon Credit Unit, that's the unit that will be produced under the CFI. My understanding is the unit under the carbon price mechanism may be called something else, but I'm not 100% sure about that. The Clean Energy Future has been already shortened to CEF, which is the carbon price mechanism. I'm going to talk a bit about the National Carbon Offset Standard because that's really where the voluntary market will come from. DOIC, Domestic Offsets Integrity Committee. They're looking at the approval of methodologies under the CFI. So they provide advice to the minister basically for approving the methodologies. So previously, the main national carbon offset scheme was greenhouse friendly, ran from 2001 and wound up in July 2010. It was sort of made up of two parts: a broad scope of offset programs, reforestation, as well as emission reduction projects, energy savings projects, landfill gas projects. They were big under the greenhouse friendly program, and a few others. It also had another side, which was a carbon neutral thing for certification for companies and products to claim they were carbon neutral. So that was the voluntary market side, if you like, of the greenhouse friendly, and then it had the offset side. It was phased out coming up to July 2010 with a view that the National Carbon Offset Standard would replace greenhouse friendly, and the carbon price through the CPRS would replace the sort of demand, I guess, and also the CPRS included some forestry offsets. So that's the CPRS, again, two parts: carbon price, and it had forestry, and then later on they added agricultural offsets, and that wasn't really that well developed, I don't think, at the time, but certainly it had those two parts. The things in the offset side that they were going to include were all the Kyoto compliant, or the compliance market credits. So I might talk about the sort of Kyoto, non-Kyoto in a minute, but it basically was anything in an offsets market that might be considered eligible in the compliance market was going to be included in the CPRS. Anything that wasn't was going to be included in the NCOS. So they again had these, I guess they had four parts then, because they had a compliance, carbon price and an offsets market, and they also had a non-compliance carbon price with the voluntary market and offsets market. So obviously there's a lot of people that invested heavily in greenhouse friendly and were looking to roll into a market with the CPRS, and so they started looking at that time about what they could do about it, and out of that came the Carbon Farming Initiative. The kind of range of decisions they went through when they were looking at the CFI was integrating or not integrating into the offset side of the NCOS, running it again as an administrative scheme, or going right through to a regulatory environment, which is where they ended up. A number of reasons, I guess, for entering into that regulatory environment. They wanted it to be robust enough to be able to deal in the compliance market, which they knew would be obviously legislated. So having two legislated schemes was obviously good for that. They also, one of the big things I think they wanted to deal with was permanence and compliance issues. it's much easier to have a legislative scheme with compliance embedded in it than it is to have a contract with people and having to chase people for compliance issues through another legal process, I guess. So they could have sort of fines and things tied up in legislation for non-compliance, whereas if it was a contract type arrangement, they'd have to actually chase people through other means, and it wasn't seen to be as robust or in a lot of ways as efficient. So that was the other big driver of this, was efficiency and cost efficiencies. The first sort of series of consultations on the CFI happened around that November to January timeframe, and in March 2011 they had the DOIC established and ready to accept methodologies. It was set up as an interim DOIC because obviously there was no law sitting behind it, so they had to have a temporary situation until the legislation was passed. And then the legislation itself has been through a number of committees. The Senate and House of Representatives both had a committee to analyse it. Large number of submissions going into those. So I think there was 75 submissions went into the Senate committee alone. There was another several hundred submissions from organisations and individuals going through into some of the consultation processes. So quite a lot of consultation went into building the phase, I guess, of of the legislation. And then in August, the August sitting just recently, the legislation was actually passed through Parliament. And presumably it has the support of both sides of government. The opposition's come out and said they'd like to keep it. They don't agree with everything in it, but they think it's not a bad scheme. So in some ways we've got to a position now where, with no certainty, no market, nothing, we've actually got some certainty for the supply side going forward now for a while. So that's actually a big step, and a big positive step forward for everyone who's invested in this stuff. I guess just the sort of component parts. There's legislation that's been covered, passed. Regulations, they're still drafting the sort of main set of regulations. No one's seen them. Hopefully they'll be out soon. They want to have the scheme up and running by 1st of December is the latest date. So obviously they have to have those regulations drafted out for consultation and back and then into Parliament before then. And Parliament basically has has an option of disallowing those regulations. They don't have to pass them necessarily, but the regulations will include the reporting and auditing requirements of projects and those types of rules. So a lot of the project-based rules will sit in there. It will include, I think Stuart mentioned the sort of positive-negative list, and I'll go into that a bit more in a minute and explain what those things are. But again, there are sort of eligibility rules, if you like, broad-level eligibility rules. And then the other big part, which is like a regulation, is the methodologies themselves. So there'll be lots of individual methodologies for projects to follow that will be embedded as a legislative instrument, they're called. And I'm presuming some of this stuff at the bottom, but effectively there's going to have to be a lot of guidance coming from the department. There's already a few tools that they've put out to support methodologies. There'll need to be some sort of mapping standards and things like that they'll look to produce, I'm assuming, over time, over the next little while. There's lots of places where people can participate in the CFI. There's lots of skills required and there's lots of bits and pieces, but effectively the process for participating will be business or individual registration with the CFI itself, proving that you're fit and proper to participate in the scheme. Having a project, what does that mean? Well, you have to be eligible under the legislations and regulations. You have to have an activity that's on the positive list and also not on the negative list, obvious. And it has to be within the scope of an already approved methodology. So the methodologies will set up the broad framework around activities, and an activity being put up under a project will have to say, this is the methodology I'm going to use for this particular activity. Some of the rules that aren't there in this monitoring, auditing and reporting, so those types of rules are coming through, but it's likely that the projects will need some kind of third-party audit. There's some thought about how you might do that. Some methodologies may actually be much more straightforward and not require that. They might use a model, so you can sort of audit the model inputs instead of going out on site and auditing the actual project itself. So there's a whole scope of possibilities that might come out of that. And one of the biggest places where cost will be built into this over time is in that audit situation. If you're paying third-party auditors to come out every year to verify your credits, then that's obviously a big cost. If you can do it every 5 years, that's obviously less of a cost. So that there's a fair bit in that, and that's still to come out. And then the auditing process will also basically check off that your systems and your calculations match up with what's in the methodology. Make sure you've got the evidence and justification to say yes, you can effectively use that methodology. And then just the final part, the crediting. So the Australian National Registry of Emissions Units will hold the accounts that then hold the ACCUs, and there'll be a process around transferring ACCUs through that registry to buyers or cancelling them if you're doing a voluntary transaction and you want to retire those units. So that'll all happen in the sort of the crediting part or in the registry. There's lots of areas to participate, large sets of rules. Some of it's quite complex. There's still lots of uncertainty because the regulations aren't out yet, and that's really going to contain most of the detailed rules about reporting, auditing and compliance. There's already a large number of companies, obviously, as coming from greenhouse friendly, people participating in these types of projects for international markets. A few companies from Australia went and participated in the New Zealand scheme when the New Zealand scheme got up. So there's companies with lots of experience, but there's no doubt there's going to be lots and lots of companies springing up as opportunities arise. And it's just one of those places where this is just going to develop. It's going to develop quickly, but really lots of parts of it will develop quite slowly. So the methodology, data, research will develop slowly. Markets may develop quite quickly, and it's going to be probably an interesting time, I would think.